The city had already fallen. The gates were broken. The standards of Rome snapped in the wind above the walls. Smoke climbed into the night sky like a black funeral shroud. Somewhere in the darkness, a temple roof collapsed, sending sparks into the heavens. But inside the palace, no one feared the battle anymore. They feared the night, because in the ancient world, defeat did not end when the fighting stopped. For queens, noblewomen, and royal households, the most dangerous moment began only after the legions won. This was the night when power reversed, when crowns became chains, when silk robes met iron discipline, when the world of a ruling dynasty was stripped away by men who believed conquest granted them more than territory. It granted them dominance. To understand what happened after Roman victory, we must first understand Rome itself. The Roman definition of victory to modern eyes, war ends with surrender. To Rome, victory was theater. When Roman legions conquered a kingdom, whether in Greece, Gaul, Egypt, or Judea, the battle was only phase one. What followed was carefully structured, organized, ritualized. Roman war was not chaos, it was system. After a city fell, three forces moved into action: the military command, the political apparatus, the machinery of humiliation. Because Rome did not merely defeat enemies, it transformed them. The palace after the breach, when a royal capital was captured, soldiers secured gates, armories, and treasury vaults first. Gold mattered, weapons mattered, hostages mattered most. Elite women, queens, princesses, royal widows, were considered political assets, not because Rome respected them, but because Rome understood symbolism. In monarchies, queens embodied legitimacy, bloodline, divine right. So Roman commanders moved quickly to seize them. They were not random captives. They were trophies of state, and their treatment depended entirely on one question: were they more valuable alive or erased? The politics of captivity: the Romans were pragmatic. A captured queen could serve three purposes: a bargaining chip, or a public symbol of submission, a living exhibit in Rome's triumphal parade. The most famous example remains the fate of Cleopatra. After aligning herself with Rome's rivals, she faced the terrifying prospect not simply of defeat, but of display. For a monarch, death could be preferable to humiliation. Why? Because of the Roman triumph. The triumph, Rome's final judgment. If a Roman general achieved extraordinary victory, the Senate might grant him a triumph, the highest honor in the Republic and later the Empire. The triumph was not merely a parade, it was a psychological execution. Captives, princes, and sometimes queens, were marched through the streets of Rome in chains. The crowd jeered. Soldiers sang mocking songs. The general rode in splendor behind them. The message was clear: behold what happens to those who resist Rome. After the parade, many royal captives were executed quietly, not in battle, but after spectacle. This is why queens feared the night of conquest, because if captured alive, they entered a system designed to erase sovereignty in stages. What the soldiers actually did, contrary to popular imagination: Roman military discipline was strict, looting was controlled. Commanders distributed spoils according to rank. Slaughter could occur, especially if resistance had been fierce, but elite prisoners were usually protected under guard. Why? Because uncontrolled violence destroyed political leverage. Roman commanders understood value. A living queen meant negotiation power, ransom, intelligence, and spectacle. However, lower-ranking palace attendants and non-elite women did not always receive such structured protection. After cities like Carthage or Jerusalem fell, chaos and brutality erupted among common populations. War in the ancient world was merciless. But when it came to ruling dynasties, Rome preferred humiliation over randomness, because humiliation traveled further than bloodshed. The night inside the captured palace, imagine the silence. The torches outside flicker against marble columns. Roman boots echo through corridors once walked by perfumed courtiers. Bronze doors lie splintered. In a private chamber, a queen sits motionless. Her crown has been removed. Outside, a centurion waits under orders: no harm, guard her. She is no longer sovereign, but she is not yet nothing. Her fate depends on politics hundreds of miles away in Rome. And she knows it, because she knows what happened to others before her. When queens chose death, some refused captivity entirely. Cleopatra chose suicide rather than be paraded in chains. Others vanished in poisoned blade or ritual fire rather than surrender their bodies to Roman display. To them, death preserved royal dignity. Captivity meant transformation into symbol, and Rome excelled at symbolism. Psychological warfare: Rome understood that conquest was incomplete if resistance could inspire rebellion. Executing a king might spark martyrdom. Displaying a defeated monarch in chains destroyed mystique. It told every province, your gods did not protect them, your bloodline failed. This is why Roman soldiers guarded elite captives so carefully in the immediate aftermath. The night after victory was not chaos. It was transition, from battlefield dominance to political theatre. But not all queens were paraded, some were absorbed, married into Roman aristocracy, exiled quietly, confined in villas under supervision. Rome adapted strategy depending on the political climate. For example, after defeating Hellenistic kingdoms in the east, Rome often preferred indirect control. Client rulers were installed. Royal women were sometimes allowed to live under watch, because sometimes mercy strengthened empire more than terror. The difference between legend and reality. Modern myths exaggerate what Roman soldiers did in the immediate hours after conquest. Yes, ancient warfare was brutal. Yes, civilian populations often suffered. But Rome's strength lay in discipline, hierarchy, and calculated humiliation, not uncontrolled chaos at the top levels of power. Queens feared the night not because of random violence, but because of calculated erasure. Their fate would be decided not by drunken soldiers, but by the machinery of empire. And once that machinery began turning, it did not stop. Yet one question remains. What happened after they reached Rome? What did captivity truly look like once the cheers of the triumph faded? And what became of royal bloodlines when they were absorbed into the Roman system? The answers reveal a darker truth about power, one that extends far beyond swords and crowns. When the ships reached the mouth of the Tiber, the real transformation began. The queen was no longer in her palace. She was cargo, guarded, watched, catalogued, and Rome was waiting. Arrival in the capital of the world. From the harbour at Ostia, captives were transported upriver toward the beating heart of the empire. The skyline of Rome rose in layers. Temples, basilicas, crowded insulas stacked like stone honeycombs. This was not merely a city, it was a statement. And every captive royal understood something immediately. They were now inside a machine larger than any kingdom they had ruled. The same system that processed grain, taxes, and armies would now process them. Processing the defeated. Contrary to popular myth, elite captives were not thrown into common slave pens. They were registered, interrogated, assessed. Roman officials documented lineage, political connections, potential alliances, remaining loyalists, and any value that could be extracted, diplomatic or symbolic. Because Rome did not conquer to destroy alone, it conquered to absorb, and absorption required information. A captured queen might know a treasury locations, a loyal provincial governors, hidden alliances, the military weaknesses, or religious influence networks. Her knowledge could prevent future uprisings, or enable them, if mishandled. So she was guarded carefully, not out of compassion, but because information was power. House arrest, the gilded cage. If a triumph was pending, high-value captives were often confined under house arrest, sometimes in state buildings, sometimes in guarded villas outside the city. Their surroundings could be surprisingly comfortable. Marble floors, servants, private chambers. But make no mistake, it was imprisonment. The guards rotated shifts, letters were monitored, visitors were approved or denied by magistrates. They could not leave. They were alive only because Rome had not finished using them. The countdown to the triumph, the waiting was its own torment. Because once the Senate approved a triumph, preparations began across the city. The route was planned, spoils were displayed. Artists prepared painted panels showing scenes of battle, and the captives were informed of their role. They would walk, chained, before the Roman people. The triumph was not about cruelty. It was about narrative control. Rome told a story of inevitability. We rise, they fall. The parade of submission on the day of the triumph. The city swelled with noise. Citizens lined the streets from the campus marches to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Trumpets sounded. Incense burned. Soldiers marched in perfect formation. Behind wagons of gold and captured standards came the living proof of victory. Defeated rulers, bound in ceremonial chains, their garments sometimes replaced with simpler attire, stripping them of royal distinction. The crowd reacted differently depending on the enemy. Foreign kings from distant lands provoked curiosity. Rebels inspired anger. But the message remained identical. Even royalty kneels before Rome. After the applause, this is where myth and reality diverged sharply. Not all captives were executed, some were, particularly those deemed too dangerous to remain alive. Others disappeared quietly into confinement. A few were spared execution, but lived the rest of their lives under surveillance. Because killing a royal could create legend, keeping them alive, powerless, could erase them. And Rome understood erasure. The psychology of erasure. When a monarchy falls, its strength often survives in memory. But memory requires symbols. Rome removed those symbols. Royal regalia confiscated. Family members separated. Dynasties fragmented. Children of defeated rulers were sometimes raised in Roman households, educated in Latin, trained in Roman customs. Within a generation, former heirs could become Romanized aristocrats. The bloodline survived, the sovereignty did not. This was conquest beyond battlefield victory. This was identity replacement. The fear of being forgotten for queens raised to believe they ruled by divine right. The true horror was not death. It was irrelevance. In Rome, they were no longer sacred figures. They were examples. Their languages were foreign, their gods exotic curiosities, their former titles reduced to footnotes in senatorial records. They had ruled nations. Now they were entries in archives. And that transformation, from sovereign to spectacle, happened because Roman soldiers held discipline long enough for the system to take over. The night after conquest was only the first step. The months after were the real dismantling. When Rome showed mercy, not all outcomes were bleak. Rome sometimes used captured royalty strategically. Marriages were arranged to stabilize provinces. Exiled queens lived in relative comfort under supervision. Some even became cultural intermediaries between Rome and their homelands. The empire was ruthless, but it was also pragmatic. Power to Rome was not emotional. It was calculated. The final stage, absorption or oblivion. There were only 3 long-term outcomes for a defeated queen. Public execution after triumph, permanent confinement under watch, gradual absorption into Roman society. Each option served Rome. Each option eliminated sovereign threat. Each option ensured that the empire's authority was never visibly challenged. And the Roman soldiers who first entered those captured palaces, they were only the opening act. Their discipline ensured that elite captives survived long enough to be politically weaponized. This was not random brutality. It was institutional domination. The larger pattern of empire across Spain, Gaul, Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt. The pattern repeated. Victory, capture, display, transformation. Rome did not merely win wars. It rewrote identities. It converted monarchies into provinces. It turned royal courts into administrative districts. And in doing so, it reshaped the ancient world permanently. But something changed as Rome evolved from republic to empire. Because when emperors replaced generals as the central authority, of the treatment of defeated royalty shifted again. Personal power replaced senatorial restraint, and the line between spectacle and cruelty began to blur. What happened when emperors themselves sought glory through humiliation? How did imperial paranoia reshape the fate of captured queens? And when Rome eventually weakened, did its own elites face the same rituals of submission it once imposed on others? The answers reveal that conquest is a cycle, and no empire escapes its own methods forever. The empire had mastered the art of humiliation, but empires change, and when Rome shifted from republic to empire, power no longer belonged to the Senate. It belonged to one man, and that changed everything. When generals became emperors under the republic, a victorious general required Senate approval for a triumph. Political balance restrained excess. The humiliation of foreign royalty followed ritual. But under emperors like Augustus, the center of gravity moved. Victory was no longer shared prestige. It was imperial propaganda. Captured rulers were no longer trophies of a general. They were proof of the emperor's divine favor. And emperors, unlike senators, answered to fewer equals. That meant mercy and brutality now depended on personality. Imperial paranoia. As Rome expanded, threats multiplied, not only from outside, but within. Rival claimants, ambitious generals, restless provinces. A captured queen was no longer just a symbol of conquest. She could become a symbol of rebellion. And emperors feared symbols. Under rulers such as Tiberius and later Nero, political anxiety intensified. Suspicion defined governance. Foreign royalty in captivity were watched more closely. Alliances were scrutinized. Even rumors could mean death, because the empire had grown vast, and vast empires fear instability above all. The double-edged sword of spectacle. The triumph continued under the emperors, but its meaning evolved. It was no longer a rare honor. It became absorbed into imperial ceremony. Some emperors denied triumphs to generals entirely, reserving glory for themselves. Captured kings and queens now reinforced the narrative. Rome rules because the emperor rules. But spectacle carries risk. A public execution could inspire sympathy. A defiant captive could command respect. And Rome understood that the crowd was unpredictable. The case of the defiant queen. History remembers rulers who resisted Roman dominance. One of the most formidable was Boudicca after her uprising in Britain. Roman retaliation was devastating. Cities burned. Thousands died. But when defeat became inevitable, she reportedly chose death rather than capture. Rome was denied the spectacle, denied the chains, denied the parade. Her choice turned her into legend, and that was the danger. Because sometimes execution creates silence, but suicide creates myth. Children of the conquered, when queens were captured alive, their children faced a different fate. Rome often spared them, not out of mercy, but strategy. Royal heirs could be raised in Roman households, taught Latin rhetoric, Roman law, Roman military customs. They were hostages of culture. Over time, many forgot the language of their ancestors. They married into Roman elite families. They governed provinces, not as independent monarchs but as Roman administrators. The dynasty survived biologically. It died politically. This was Rome's quietest victory. The long night of adjustment. Imagine the months after capture. The rituals complete. The crowds gone. The palace replaced by guarded residents. A queen who once commanded armies now negotiates for small dignities. Access to religious rites. Letters to surviving relatives. The right to retain certain attendants. The psychological shift was immense. Power had once radiated outward from her. Now permission flowed inward from Rome. Some adapted. Some resisted. Some deteriorated. But all existed within the empire's design. When Rome turned inward, yet empires that perfect humiliation often internalize it. As political instability grew in later centuries, Roman elites began experiencing the same spectacles once reserved for foreign royalty. Rivals were paraded, senators executed, emperors overthrown. The machinery of humiliation no longer required foreign enemies. It fed on itself. By the crisis of the 3rd century, emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Loyalty shifted. Armies proclaimed their own rulers. And in that instability, Rome's earlier confidence, its calculated discipline, began to crack. Because humiliation is powerful, but it is corrosive. The final irony for centuries, conquered queens feared the night Roman soldiers entered their cities. They feared chains, they feared the triumph, they feared erasure, but in the end Rome itself would experience invasion. Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths. When the city of Rome was sacked in 410 under Alaric I, the psychological shock reverberated across the Mediterranean world. The Eternal City, once the orchestrator of humiliation, faced violation. History does not repeat cleanly, but it echoes. What the night really meant. So, what did Roman soldiers do after victory? They secured, they guarded, they calculated. They transformed royalty into instruments of empire. The terror queens felt was not rooted in chaotic violence alone. It was rooted in systematic dismantling, the removal of crown, the stripping of narrative, the conversion of sovereignty into spectacle. Because Rome understood something fundamental: power is not destroyed in a single moment. It is dismantled in stages, and the longest stage begins after the battle ends. Yet one final question remains. Did any queen ever outmaneuver Rome? Did any captive turn humiliation into influence? Did any royal woman use the empire's own system to carve out unexpected power within captivity? The answer is more complicated than legend suggests, and it reveals that even inside the machinery of conquest, one agency sometimes survived. Right, an annexed part. Not every captured queen disappeared into silence. Some learned how the Roman system worked, and then, slowly, they used it. Because the empire that dismantled monarchies also depended on alliances, patronage, and influence. Within that structure, a clever royal captive could sometimes reshape her fate, not by open resistance, but by adaptation. Learning the Roman game once inside Rome, foreign royalty were exposed to something unfamiliar: a political culture built not only on bloodline, but on networks. Influence moved through patronage, through marriage, through favor with powerful families, and through proximity to the emperor. Queens who understood this began to realize something important. Rome had stripped them of crowns, but it had not erased their intelligence, education, or diplomatic experience. Many royal women had grown up negotiating treaties, managing courts, and navigating rival factions long before their kingdoms fell. Those skills did not disappear. They simply operated in a new arena. Royal women as cultural bridges. Some captive queens became intermediaries between Rome and their former territories. They understood the language, the religion, the political traditions of their homeland. Roman governors often lacked that knowledge, so the empire sometimes used royal captives as advisors, informally, cautiously. Their role was subtle. They could explain local customs, advise on provincial tensions, interpret messages from distant elites. In doing so, they remained politically relevant, not as rulers, but as translators between worlds. Marriage as strategy. Rome rarely allowed captive queens to remarry freely, but marriages could be arranged when they served imperial stability. A royal widow might be paired with a loyal provincial governor. A princess might marry into a Roman aristocratic family. These unions were rarely romantic. They were political tools. But they created something powerful: blended identities. Children born from these marriages carried both local royal blood and Roman citizenship. To the empire, this was ideal. It diluted independent monarchy while strengthening provincial loyalty. The Romanization of dynasties. Over time, many once ruling families became Roman elites. Their descendants spoke Latin, served in the Roman army, entered the Senate, The transformation was gradual but deliberate. Rome did not always erase dynasties. It absorbed them, and in doing so, it expanded the definition of what it meant to be Roman. This process helped stabilize vast territories from Spain to Syria. But it also changed the empire itself, because Rome slowly became a fusion of cultures. The empire that became the world by the 2nd century CE. Roman rule extended across 3 continents. The empire governed Greeks, Egyptians, Gauls, Syrians, North Africans, and countless smaller peoples. And within that enormous system, the descendants of conquered royalty lived alongside old Roman aristocrats. The lines between conqueror and conquered blurred. In some cases, royal bloodlines once humiliated in triumphs were now woven into imperial society. History rarely moves in straight lines. The hidden legacy of the captive queens. The night of conquest had seemed like the end. But sometimes it was the beginning of a different kind of power. Queens who survived captivity passed down knowledge, language, and cultural identity to their children. They preserved traditions quietly. They influenced households. They shaped the upbringing of future provincial leaders. While Rome claimed political victory, culture flowed both directions. Empires rarely notice how much they absorb. The strategic genius of Rome's treatment of defeated royalty reveals something deeper about its success. The empire did not rely solely on destruction. It used integration. Violence opened the door. Administration stabilized it. Culture filled the space afterward. This combination allowed Rome to dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries. Many conquerors could win battles. Few could transform enemies into participants within the same political system. But the system had limits. Absorption worked when Rome was strong, when its economy functioned, when its armies remained disciplined. But as centuries passed, pressure mounted. Economic strain, political corruption, civil wars, external invasions. The same structures that once processed conquered queens began to fracture under internal conflict. And as the empire weakened, its ability to control narrative weakened too. When empires lose the story, Rome's greatest weapon had always been its story. Rome is inevitable. Rome is eternal. Rome cannot be resisted. But when emperors began rising and falling rapidly, when borders cracked, when invasions reached the heart of the empire, that story began to collapse. And once belief collapses, power follows. The rituals that once humiliated defeated monarchs no longer carried the same authority. The empire could still fight, but it could no longer project inevitability. The last lesson the night conquered queens feared most was never just about soldiers entering a palace. It was about the beginning of a process, a machine that dismantled sovereignty piece by piece. Rome perfected that machine. Yet history shows a paradox. The same mechanisms that dominate others can eventually dominate those who created them. Because systems built on power, spectacle, and control require constant strength to maintain. When strength fades, the machinery turns unpredictable, and empires, like kingdoms before them, discover that no throne is permanent. In the end, Roman soldiers did not simply conquer cities. They initiated transformations. They turned royal courts into provinces, queens into captives, dynasties into memories, and the ancient world into something entirely new. But the deeper story is not just about conquest. It is about adaptation, survival, and the fragile nature of power itself. Because every empire believes its victory will last forever, history quietly proves otherwise.